So welcome to Convergence. I'm Lauren Hoque Zafer from Zurich.
I'm Faisal Hoque from Stanford, Connecticut.
The US has just thrown down the gauntlet in the global AI race. Its new AI action plan isn't about control, it's about speed. By dismantling regulatory barriers and adopting a try-first philosophy, Washington is effectively handing the keys to the private sector. For global firms, this transforms the US market into a high-velocity, high-stakes test bed. It's an unprecedented opportunity to innovate, test MVPs, and deploy new tools faster than anywhere else on Earth. But this freedom, of course, comes at a steep price. With fewer federal guardrails, the full responsibility for managing catastrophic failure, ethical breaches, and brand-destroying outcomes shifts almost entirely onto the company. The plan forces what can be classified as a dual mindset: radical optimism to seize the opportunity using frameworks like open, and deep caution to manage the inevitable amplified risks using frameworks like care. The question for every leader is no longer if they should engage, but how they will navigate this new landscape where the accelerator is floored, but the brakes are their sole responsibility. So welcome to Convergence. Convergence is a series dedicated to exploring the pivotal intersections of technology, business, and leadership. Now, Faisal, I'm actually really excited about this episode because it also gives me a chance to dive deeper into this topic. I know that you are already further ahead in your exploration because you've written an article about this particular topic, and it is the inspiration for what we want to share with the audience today. And as we just discussed, it's an ever important topic that I don't think is too prominent, in the sense that maybe less people know about this particular movement than we feel should. When you hear the US's governmental plan, or the government's plan is to dismantle regulatory barriers for AI, what's your immediate response? Is it excitement, anxiety? What's your response?
It's a little bit of both, because I'm in this space, but also the work we do at US government. And this particular article, and I wrote it for IMD, I by IMD, particularly because I wanted to showcase the contradiction, or like the two sides between the US mentality and EU mentality in terms of more regulation and more cautious approach. And how does multinational deal with that? Because multinationals obviously doing business across the globe, not just in one side of the pond and both sides of the pond. So I am both optimistic and cautious as always, because optimistic in the sense that this does opens up a lot of opportunity to do a lot of experimentation, but it also creates a lot of risk. I mean, even in our past few episodes when we talked about the digital doppelganger and we talked about the deep fake and that sort of a thing, it opens up a lot of risk on a consumer level, but it also opens up a lot of risk at a organizational level. So U.S. approach to this is not just, it's not regulation, but rather utilizing, we have a standard body called NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, that has these AI RMF, which is called AI Risk Management Framework. So the government approach, U.S. current administration approach, is that we should be adhering to that, and that should suffice mitigate the risk. But we know how that goes.
I mean, I think that I would agree in the sense that there is a lot of opportunistic avenue that can be explored, given the fact that it is an encouragement for innovation and also fail fast if you are going to fail. But if we take one step back, and you've highlighted the NIST framework, let's look at what the AI action plan actually is from America. So from my understanding, there's the American AI action plan. So the US government has published a blueprint, and this blueprint is for maintaining American dominance in the age of AI.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
Yeah, because in US, we want to push boundary as hard as we can. so that we can compete against various adversaries and also the other players in the globally, like whether that's China, whether that's India, whatever the case may be. We want to maintain that innovation edge as much as we can.
So if we look at, and I just want to look at the shift in mindset from the previous administration to the administration just now. So rather than the government, from our understanding, then coordinating and safeguarding AI deployment, as was under previous US administrations and most other countries at the moment, the plan seems to set out more of an approach that emphasizes deregulation, private sector development, and as I mentioned, a try first mentality. Would you agree with that?
100%. I mean, so what this plan really boils down to, like in EU, as you know from where you are, there is like a coordinated effort to create a lot of legislation and laws and other type of governance framework that are mandated by government, right? In US case, its onus is upon the organization and the enterprises by following these NIST and other type of standards and governance model that are out there versus legislation. That's the key difference, right? So it's government's hands-off approach, meaning US government's hands-off approach, and the onus is on the enterprise and organization, how much governance you want to put to safeguard AI and the risk that comes with it.
I'm sure we're going to talk about it in a little bit more detail, as you mentioned, like the way that multinational companies can actually navigate that. But I think that if we go back to, I asked you the question at the start of your own gut reaction, and then I think about my own gut reaction to that. So I think like the response that I would focus on is more like the immediate response or thought was that it's a little bit of a provocation. Like it accelerates almost like this tech Cold War, in the sense that, you know, there's a direct challenge, as you've highlighted as well, to other nations. If you look at maybe primarily China, you know, forcing them into a counter, and also the analysis of their own maybe state-directed plans. And I think as well that it also solidifies this trend towards like tech blocks with different AI ecosystems, standard rules, making global cooperation much harder. And I think when you move into that direction of these siloed tech blocks, then that enhances a lot more necessity for AI safety and also recognition. And then I think that it could possibly become somewhat of a nightmare, as you've said, for a multinational organization to navigate that when you have a US entity that has this fail fast, less regulation, and then the EU counteract. One question before we explore that is, do you think that a move fast and break things approach is the best strategy to take to win the AI global race?
Look, I mean, you can do that on an experimentation level, perhaps, right? I've always been the proponent of that. Innovation without risk management, innovation without responsibility always bites you back, right? So, that's why we created this open and care framework, whereby you basically say, okay, you have to create a portfolio of opportunity, but you also have to come up with the risk associated with each of those initiatives and how you balance it and how you exit it. And it's not like you cannot experiment with a cautious approach, but you have to think through what you're experimenting and what is the impact that's going to have. You can't just push things out there without deliberate thoughts and deliberate governance model, both technically and from a legislative point of view, right? So in that context, I think that it's highly irresponsible of any organizational leader if they say, we don't care, we just want to push things out there and whatever happens, happens. That will have major implication on healthcare, financial market, manufacturing, government services, et cetera, a data leak, deep fake, you name it, will have all of those. So it has the potential of creating complete chaos. So that's one part. The other part is that when you talk about multinationals, which was the focus of that particular article, we already have seen this in terms of cloud computing, whereby what resides on on this side of the pond and who can host a series of data in US side and who can do that in EU side is different, right? And all multinational have to think through, and you have to put together some sort of a guardrail, right? So this gets very challenging because in every single project a multinational will have to take, based on the target market, you will have to have a different kind of deployment and different kind of infrastructure than you would have otherwise. It's not like you go on ChatGPT and create a project and start throwing your data and start doing things.
No, 100%. And I think that anyone that's familiar with technology and that's been involved in the intrinsics of deploying technology, again, for more regulated industries like healthcare, pharma, biotech, then not only, because there's also those considerations if you're hosting data, as you've mentioned, in Europe versus the US. But that's like data hosting. And I think that there's been that development within the field, and also the development, as you've mentioned, of, you know, cloud compute, the evolution, the necessity, the consequential thinking of that evolution that's made us think about those things for a long time. But with the AI action plan, and it goes back to, I think, what I responded to when you were talking there, is more like push it out there, we don't care. Companies are not going to do that. But also there's the possibility of, are they really tuned in enough to understand what the consequential outcome can be? And one thing that I liked about, if you look at the paper that you wrote, Faisal, we mentioned it in the introduction to this particular session, is this dual mindset. So the radical optimism versus the deep caution. And you've got the open framework and the care framework. Now, if we look at the point of the unknown of what could be the consequences, you seem to highlight something that is extremely important in this care element. Can you maybe expand on the catastrophize and the assessment and how a company can actually use that as well?
It's really, you know, whenever you're creating opportunity or whenever you're exploring opportunity, one thing most people don't do or most leaders don't do is this notion of you have to look at risk at a very deep level. So the care framework challenges you to think about the worst case scenario, right? So the first letter of care is C, which stands for catastrophize. Is the idea is, okay, let's think about what's the worst case thing can that happen? What happens if we mingle data? What happens if we expose data? What happens if we start to create, use synthetic data versus the original data? All those type of things. And what is the impact, right? So it starts with that. And then once you've identified those kind of risk area, then you have to assess, is it worth taking that risk or whether it's not taking that risk? And then how do you regulate that from a governance point of view at a board level and C-suite level and et cetera, but also from a technical point of view at a project level? What kind of guardrail can you put at a technical infrastructure level to regulate this? And then finally figuring out, okay, what's the exit strategy if things really go bad and it's not worth doing it? And are we willing to call it a quits and restart or reinvent or redo the things, right? Often enough, when you get into this innovator's mindset and you're pushing fast, you don't really think about those things. And we've seen time and time again, we have created catastrophic situation because we haven't thought through the risk. Risk management and risk evaluation, both from an enterprise and a project point of view, is not a luxury and it's not holding you back. It's being responsible. And ultimately, you'll gain more from it because your impact will be a lot more positive than negative.
And we've also seen as well that this is a component of development that organizations are not thinking about, this risk management aspect. And one thing that's quite fascinating in the exit strategy, as you've highlighted, is the 3-layer exit plan. So you've got the component of analysis around risk management on a technical, but also on a reputational and legal level. So for anyone that has maybe tried and failed quite quickly in the deployment of an embedded B2B system, then they have to think about, what does the technical rollback look like? Is a true immediate parallel human in the loop system even feasible at scale? And I think that's when it gets interesting, where you are going not only just in MVP direction, but then you're going in full scale fledged like deployment, and there's the lack of regulation and what can happen.
I mean, it could be disastrous, right? I mean, you could, like, so for example, take a technical layer, if you start with that, we can say, okay, you can have wrong forecast, wrong diagnosis. You could have wrong type of audience for the data set that you're trying to deliver, right? So that's technical level, right? Think about the reputation. Imagine I am a part of a healthcare system and my data all of a sudden is on everybody's hand, and we just violated the HIPAA law, which in US that's related to healthcare data protection and individual rights for healthcare data protection, right? So just completely ruined your reputation. And then there's a legal issue associated with harming your consumer, right? So if you don't think through all that, you bring the entire organization at a screeching halt. This is where three layers of thinking from technical, reputational, and legal point of view, you have to rack and stack. You have to have a matrix of racking and stacking in terms of what is the level of threat or what is the level of risk that you're encountering or taking on. And based on that, you decide whether you should even go into it or just exit out of it, right?
Yeah. And I think that what would be good is if we help the viewers and listeners understand that this framework is accessible in Faisal's recent book. So Faisal's recent book, Transcend, it's available there, and it's also available as a shortened version in the Harvard Business Review article that you wrote on it as well. So Faisal, one thing that I also thought about as well is that in America, there's very much not only now a sort of an encouragement of fail fast culture, but also there's this encouragement for the opportunity to invest in new ideas, innovation, because of the accessibility that's provided and the culture that's been built around Silicon Valley. So if you were a venture capitalist, do you think that this action plan, the AI action plan, makes US-based AI startups more or less attractive?
I actually wrote a piece a while back on Fortune highlighting cases from, even if you look at most successful tech companies, let's take Apple or Pixar or that sort of like Steve Jobs' attitude about move fast and whatnot. They took very deliberate approach in terms of how they deploy technology and make things happen, right? In my own case, I had a company in 90s whereby I raised a lot of venture capital money, and we were doing extremely well by working with some of the best Fortune 50 enterprises. And my venture people thought that I was not moving fast enough, so they fired me and they ran the whole company to the ground after 18 months of me being fired because they wanted to move too fast, right? So they hired a whole lot of people, they went after the market. So this notion of moving fast and failing fast comes with the associated risk of actually totally ruining a new venture, right? So venture requires obviously coming up with the product, proving the product, getting feedback from the customer. It's hard to kind of accelerate some of those cycles, especially if it's super innovative and you're introducing a whole new way of doing things in a particular market segment. So if I was investing in a venture, I would be very much focusing on opportunity, but also risk and how do I mitigate the risk and how do I go slow so that I can be regenerative and sustainable versus just fail fast and I may not be able to recuperate from that failure.
Yeah, sure. But do you not think that there's always that
Yes.
conflict, especially when it comes to, incubators or startups, that you've got that conflict? Anyone who accepts capital and is backed by an investor or is backed by a venture or whatever, but if there is that injection of capital, there's always the perspective and the expectation. It's that pressure in startups and scale-ups where you have to deliver. And I think that there's sometimes that misalignment from a VC or an investor's perspective as to how fast you actually can move. But here also, I think it's the added pressure of they now have an opportunity, if it is a US-backed venture by, a US individual or company, that they can say, well, you know what, there's an
There's no
accelerator.
barrier.
You can go as
Sure.
fast as you want now because
Sure.
there's no barrier. So do you think that that will now be an added pressure where you've got this weight for, exponential growth can happen
no,
because there's
so this is where
saving?
experience comes in, right? So in the sense that experienced leader or investors or entrepreneurs always takes a balanced approach, right? So you can move fast, but you can also be cautious, right? You can try to move fast, and there's like the graveyard of entrepreneurship and technology is full with names that most of us never heard of, because most of the cases they didn't really think through and had a deliberated execution model, right? They just moved fast as we could, burn through as much capital as you could, and just went at it. So
Yeah.
if you are a experienced entrepreneur or an experienced leader, you go at it like, okay, when is the right time to push the gas and when is the right time to put the brake so that you can rethink, right? And investors, the right investors are patient investors, especially in the venture space, that should be guiding the leaders and the entrepreneurs so that they can do the right thing, not just how fast can I move. Look, I mean, it's a pull and push, right? Because it cannot be so slow that you never produce anything, right? But also you cannot create irresponsible product and solution that actually have a negative effect on the market as well as on your organization. So it's a balance.
Then you've got, it's definitely a balance. There's a million other questions that's going around in my head because that's alone a fascinating topic, how that impacts investment in startups or scale ups. One thing though, you've also got that if we're talking about the sort of clash or misalignment or expectation management, you've also got that internally. So if you look at what we were speaking about, the dual mindset of both the optimism from the open framework, and then you've got the caution that's highlighted by the plan outlined in the care framework. How do you balance that internally? Because a CEO has to operationalize that, or a COO. Like, how do you reward and how do you make sure that a product team can also move in both of those directions? Like, what did you anticipate there when writing it?
So look, so there's a mindset element to it, right? If the leader doesn't establish the mindset of balance, then then nothing will happen, right? So that's one. Second is that you have to embed this framework mentality in the culture, right? In the sense that we have to be innovative and we have to explore a lot of opportunities, but we also have to come up with the risk associated with each of this initiative and how do we go about it. I mean, that's actually that's what drove us to do all of this pretty in-depth framework so that you can go through the steps, and it goes all the way from the C-suite to the implementation teams, right? And then also not just implementation team is the ongoing maintenance element of whenever you're coming up with some sort of a new product or services, right? And those technical, managerial, and legal, right? So those three, so all of this needs to be embedded part of this process. And successful organization, AI or not AI, have had elements of this all along. And that's why they're sustainable, right? That's why they sustain. Regardless of the market, regardless of the technology, they kind of sustain. I mean, you can look at Microsoft learn first mentality and then go at it, or whether you look at some of the pharma companies that goes at it from, we will take a lot of time in drug discovery before we go get for approval and testing, whatever, right? So AI kind of calls for it even more because it is easy to do stuff. You don't have to code the way you used to code. You don't have to do research the way you have to research. At least the promise of it, right? I mean, not that, every time you generating stuff with AI, it's accurate or actually usable, but that nevertheless, it does reduces cycle time significant way. So there is this allure of going even more faster and go at it as many ways as you can. But it has to be, the mindset, the culture, and the framework, and having the right SOP, the playbook and the operating procedure in place is critical.
Yeah, and I definitely think one of the key things that you mentioned at the start is really that the leader embeds this mindset of balance. It is essential from a leadership perspective. So this discussion was fascinating. I hope that our listeners and viewers have enjoyed it as much as I certainly have. Faisal looked like he was enjoying it. I think that we can only wish that everyone's enjoyed it as much as us. And if anyone does have a requested topic that they'd like us to talk about, maybe there's an expansion of this particular one or something that aligns with it, then we'd be more than happy if you popped a little comment and certainly shared that with us. So thank you, and thanks you, Faisal.
Laura. Yeah, but look, Laura, the reason I get excited about it is really when you add innovation, entrepreneurship, and technology and the governance model, and then add to the fact that opportunity to make something sustainable and something regenerative, there's a lot we can do, but doesn't mean that we become irresponsible, right? And that's what kind of triggered us to write that article for IMD. So thank you.
I think it's, as you say, as the government limits its regulatory requirements, business needs to take up the slack by becoming the sort of primary, sensible, responsible custodians of responsible AI implementation.
Absolutely.
Thank you.